get started just now. Welcome to this session. My name is Katrina Broden. I work at Glasgow Libraries and I'm also a trustee of the CELIPS board. I'm delighted to be welcoming Dr Erin Farley to do her session Tales from the Library, Local Studies, Storytelling and Oral History. Erin is the Library and Information Officer for the Local History Centre at Dundee Libraries, which holds a large and varied collection of print, photograph, manuscript and audio material, and she's also a traditional storyteller. She will be doing her session in the usual format, around 30-35 minutes of presentation, some time for questions at the end. If you can all join me in welcoming Dr Erin Farley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, and it is great to see you all here. This is my first kind of in-person conference talk for quite some time, so I hope it makes sense to you all. And welcome to Dundee, those of you who aren't normally here. It's really nice to be representing the local libraries. So I'm going to start off with this quote, which is slightly paraphrased from the folklorist Henry Glassey. And this image here, this is just kind of what you see as you come into our department in the Central Library in Dundee, and hopefully some of you may get a chance to visit the Central Library while you're here as well. But basically all history is local history, but historians have tended to focus on the local histories of regional or global elites. So this is just something that I like to start with, just to say that local history is as important, if not more important than any other kind of history. It's very much real history that we're talking about here. So just a brief introduction to what we do at the Local History Centre in Dundee. We're a very sort of public-facing and open institution, luckily, and we do have quite a large collection for a local history department. And I'm going to be speaking today primarily from a public library's point of view, but there's a lot of overlap in the material that I'm talking about with, for example, sort of university libraries or archives. So it all kind of comes together in different ways. But we try to help tell Dundee's stories. We have a collection of books. We do get non-fiction on local history topics, as you would expect, but we also collect poetry, literature, drama, which is written by local authors or set in Dundee as well. We have a very large local newspaper collection that has to be one of our most popular collections. And we have a lot of different kind of archive material, which includes manuscripts and sort of print ephemera, lots of little locally published booklets, flyers, leaflets. We have several photograph collections, mostly from the sort of late 19th and early 20th century. We have sort of three oral history collections at the moment, which I hate to admit, but they're mostly on cassette. We have just digitized one, so I am feeling very relieved about that and working on the others as fast as we can. We're also home to something called the Whiten collection of traditional music. So this is a really great collection of Scottish musical manuscripts and an old print music. And we have a dedicated Whiten Centre, which we were lucky to get funding for a few years ago. So this houses the collection, but also hosts musical classes and performances. So quite often you come in expecting local history to be the really, really quiet bit, and there's a group of people learning the penny whistle. So be warned, but usually it's very pleasant having that musical accompaniment to your studies. We also have a lot of kind of family history material, street directories, electoral registers, maps, just a lot of stuff, basically, to try and look after. But today I am actually going to be talking about some of the less visible, the less tangible aspects of local history. Primarily I'm going to be talking about traditional storytelling, but also a bit about oral history as well. And thinking about how we can work with these in local history contexts and what the potential is for the future. And I would like to say I probably will slip into using the words kind of oral or vocal talking about these traditions, but it's very important to remember that there's a really strong British Sign Language tradition as well, so not everything is oral or spoken when we think about the Scottish tradition. In Dundee also we actually had a tradition in the mills of sign language being developed there because it was too loud to communicate any other way. So that's just a disclaimer and an apology if I slip into talking about voice as the primary way of transmitting traditional things. So I'll do a quick week through the concept of oral history in case people haven't done a lot of work in this area before. Basically, it's listening to people's accounts of what happened. So it really is the oldest form of history, but it has developed as a kind of specific discipline since recording technology made it possible to actually record people speaking about their experience. And quite a lot of libraries have worked with oral history. Our collections include a big 1980s Dundee oral history project, which, watch this space, you will be hopefully seeing digitally soon. And we also have other collections about Lochee and Broughty Ferry, which are kind of specific areas of Dundee. And from my perspective, I think preserving and providing access to older oral history collections is one of the biggest challenges that we face in the digital age. And now on to traditional storytelling as well. Just before I start talking about how we work with these things, just a brief outline of what traditional storytelling is. And I don't think I need to explain this as much as I used to, because it's the Year of Scotland Stories and we're all thinking a lot about stories and what they mean and how we pass them on. But when I talk about traditional storytelling specifically, I mean stories that don't have one particular author. They're stories that are shared among a community, and this might be a place-based community, or it might be a community of interest or sort of identity as well. And although they have no one author, a lot of people shape and contribute to them and pass them on. So this includes things like your traditional folk and fairy tales, myths, origin myths, and urban legends as well. So every place and every community has its story. And while, as I say, the role of kind of memory and telling them afresh every time is really, really important here, they definitely interact with print. People will read them in books or newspapers or kind of on broadsides, cheap print things, and learn them from that and put them back out as a spoken story. And now we've got the internet as well, so the internet and urban legends is just such a fascinating thing, because stories can just explode and be around the world in minutes. So it's a really interesting context. And speaking of the internet, one of the things that I've had quite a lot of interest in recently is the idea of telling local stories online. So when the libraries went... Sorry. So in March 2020, I think everyone kind of experienced this kind of great moment of what on earth are we going to do now? We stopped being able to do anything together, indoors or outdoors. And a wee while after lockdown, I sort of realised that I wasn't going to be furloughed, I was going to be kind of working remotely. So I thought, how do we keep talking to people? How do we keep sort of trying to tell Dundee's stories throughout this? And I didn't have very much. I was working from home. I had kind of what was in my brain and a few books. And I thought, right, I'll just tell some stories. I will record one story every week until the libraries reopen. So I was thinking this was going to be, what, like 3 or 4 weeks? Obviously, that turned out to be a much bigger commitment than I thought I was making to begin with. So I kind of started, this was the first time that I'd ever recorded myself, which sounds weird now that we're all so used to that. But I remember spending absolutely ages faffing about with camera angles and like where to put my laptop and ending up exactly back where I'd started. And I just kind of recorded me talking to the camera, sort of telling stories from Dundee and the surrounding area. And some of these were sort of traditional folk tales where you've got magical sort of elements, supernatural things. And some of them were sort of more straightforward historical stories, a kind of dramatised version of things that pretty much actually happened, but usually with some exaggeration that's come in down the years. And I just put one of these videos out about 10 minutes in length every week. And it was a bit weird because, you know, I'm used to, or I was at the time, very used to speaking with a live audience, and you would have people there and you would kind of get a sense of whether they were actually enjoying it or not. And that was very much not the case when you're just talking to a screen and then you put it out. And then you do, you know, I did see that people were watching them and there were some really positive comments. So I just kind of kept doing them. But it was only actually after the libraries reopened and we kind of came back into the building and people started saying to me, oh, you know, somebody came in to get their books the other day and they mentioned that they really loved the videos, and then occasionally people would sort of recognise me from the videos. And it was only then that I kind of realised that they had actually had a lot more of a reach than I'd kind of anticipated at the time. And we did manage to get a written version of some of the stories out as well. There was a magazine called Helping Older People Engage, who put some packs together to go to care homes and sheltered housing for people that were less likely to be online. So that was a really good opportunity as well to sort of reach people who didn't have the internet in their homes, which was something that I think we were all really worried about during lockdown, is how are we reaching people who don't have the internet? And I've been thinking, I didn't necessarily pick up on this at the time, but I've been thinking about why local stories did go down so well during lockdown. And it's because we were all suddenly kind of catapulted into this really, really local you know, life. We couldn't actually go more than like, what was it, an hour's walk around your house? That's a very, very local area to suddenly be living in if you're used to being able to just kind of hop on a train or drive wherever you want to, maybe having big commutes. Everyone was suddenly kind of really getting to know their local place again. And we were all sort of walking the paths around our homes and looking at things maybe in a new way. And I think being sort of forced to live so locally did change the way that we think about the places that we live in. And it does kind of remain to be seen whether that is something that's going to stick around or if we're just going to kind of go back to the kind of way it was before. I feel like sometimes at policy level it feels like maybe we are just getting pushed to go back to the old normal, even if that's maybe not what we hoped for. But yeah, this has been one of the most visible ways that we've used stories through the library, but we have used them in other ways as well. I've done a few story walks with local community groups. And I feel like that's a really good way as well, when you can be together with people sort of walking through places where the stories are set and telling them. I will give you a health warning though. If you agree to do like a story walk on Halloween with children, please make sure you have lots of backup, especially if it's at the end of the day when they've been having their Halloween sweeties all day and they're bouncing off the walls with sugar and you're in a park and it's dark. We got through it and it was great fun, but that was quite an intense one. Why are stories such a good way of thinking about local history? They are a way of thinking about the past, and they don't necessarily tell us exactly what happened. In fact, most of them absolutely do not. But they're a really good way of getting to know a place and a community. And they're a way of thinking about emotional truth as well as the historical truth of events, because they do tell you what's important to people. And that is, I think, as important sometimes as the absolute verifiable facts. Now, this picture that I've got here, this is of a stone at Strathmartin on the outskirts of Dundee. And this is connected to one of our favourite local stories. You might have seen, if you've come down the high street, there's a statue of a dragon here. And this is a dragon who lived at Strathmartin, and he sadly ate 9 local girls before the brave blacksmith Martin managed to smash his head in with a hammer. This stone is said to be the stone that the dragon laid its head on when it died and was later carved to commemorate the battle. And this is still, like, it's a really important story in Dundee. And of course, like, this stone will have a totally different historical explanation. But we look at it now and it's the dragon's stain. So that's something. And I felt like I wanted to get the wee dragon in here for people who haven't met him before. Now, I would like to just mention a concept here. And this is the idea of intangible cultural heritage. Now, some of you might have met this term before, and some of you might not have. And basically, it's just a fancy word for a very, very old concept. So intangible cultural heritage includes stories, and it includes sort of songs, music, dance, beliefs, traditional crafts as well. So even though you may think of, like, for example, boat building or knitting are very tangible things in themselves, the methods that people use, the patterns, the designs are often passed down sort of intangibly, spoken or kind of in traditional ways. And intangible cultural heritage is recognised under a UNESCO convention as a type of world heritage. So I think this is important as well, because it says that it's a reminder that these traditions are not, these ways of experiencing and knowing the world. They're not just kind of an add-on or something that kind of lives around the real history. They are the real culture and the real history in themselves. And this isn't really a new idea either. People have been collecting what we now maybe call intangible cultural heritage and calling it folklore or traditional culture for decades. And this is just a wee slide which shows one of our local aspects of intangible cultural heritage in Dundee. This is people making dressed herrings for Hogmanay. So a local tradition that we have here was for people to basically get a herring, like a fish, and make a dress for it. And you would take this to your pal's house at New Year as a first footing gift, because, there's absolutely no luck for your year if you don't start it with a fish wearing a dress. Or possibly a kilt as well, like they had loads of different outfits. And it's just, the tradition has it's died out in recent years since the way that we celebrate New Year has changed. People aren't really going around first footing as much now. It tends to be people going to pubs or sort of central events. But this is a tradition that we've kind of worked with in the libraries as well, and we've had like little make-your-own herring stalls in the Wellgate Centre, and the children's department has done like design-your-own herring colouring in sheets for New Year. And we have moved to using wooden or cardboard fish, partly for sustainability, partly for the smell. But yeah, this is kind of one of the really specific local traditions to Dundee. And while you can't necessarily collect all the fish, you can collect sort of oral histories of people's memories of the fish. You can collect images of designs of the fish. So that's an example of how you can kind of collect around an intangible cultural heritage sort of tradition. So yeah, why does this matter for local collections? I've kind of already made the point that stories and oral history are not just a sort of method of engagement or way of doing outreach around the real history. They're not just an add-on to the main collections, they are the real history. And I think it's important to start thinking about what we consider is real history. Because if, as a sort of library working with local history, it's kind of our responsibility to represent the history and the culture of a place to the people who live there and kind of invite them in to shape that to the best that we can. And if we're going to do that, we have to think beyond standard published histories, because there are so many people who have been excluded from that in the past. And I think local collections and libraries are in some ways particularly well placed to work with this material. And many libraries, I think, as we've mentioned already, there's a real flexibility in how people do listen to their communities and respond to them. And library workers, I think, are quite at home already with the idea that stories and access to them are important. Yeah, fundamentally, libraries are about people, the people that work there and the people that use them, and being able to provide access to information and also ideally to tools that will allow communities to record their own stories and intangible cultural heritage. So that's something that I think is a huge potential for local libraries to start being hubs for, giving communities that training to record things themselves and represent themselves. There's, as I say, a huge amount of potential. There was a report in August 2021 on mapping intangible cultural heritage in Scotland. One of the routes that was highlighted as a possible way to work more with this was through groups like Lockscott, where you've got sort of local history libraries and people working with local history and libraries already coming together to sort of do this and share expertise and knowledge. There's potential for action. And I think there are potential issues as well, mostly as I've highlighted here. In order to really build these things up, you do need staff and you need time, especially when you're thinking about building up relationships with communities who we've maybe not represented so well in the past, people who haven't been as well represented in the collections we already have. It does take time to sort of build up relationships. You can't just sort of turn up with a tape recorder and go, okay, we care now, give me all your stories. Why should they? We need to do these things slowly, but I know we're all really struggling, especially in public libraries at the moment, for sort of finding the staff and the time to do anything kind of gradually. But I think I want to be hopeful here as well, because libraries are doing so much already. And I think there's probably a lot of people in this room who are doing really exciting things in these areas. And maybe it is just a case of we need to sort of come together, share each other's sort of, cheer each other on when we need cheered on as well, and try and share expertise and resources as much as we can. I have also found like partnerships can be a good way of working because I so rarely have the sort of time or resources to do a project entirely by myself. Partnering with, for example, other local organisations, possibly if often you find a university might have funding or some resources available, but they want to come to the community through a trusted route. And if you can shape a project meaningfully through that sort of partnership, it can be really, really successful. And that's one of the ways that we've managed to actually get our Dundee oral history collection digitised was through partnering with the European Ethnological Research Centre, who are based at the University of Edinburgh. And they're hoping to support more local history collection in Dundee soon as well. But yeah, this is something that hopefully we can find inspiration as well as sort of worries. Yeah, I think just to sum up a wee bit here, storytelling is definitely a great way of engaging people with their places and their history. And it is something that if you're working with local history in your library, it's something that I would highly recommend maybe thinking about doing yourself, especially if it's something that's always interested you. Maybe have a go at learning a few stories and telling them. And it is, what was I going to say? Yeah, another thing to remember, if you're eligible for Scottish Book Trust Live Literature funding, you can also use that to book traditional storytellers as well, if you did want to bring somebody in to do a storytelling workshop in your library. But also, yeah, just to say that these storytelling and sort of traditions and memories, they're more than outreach. They are a fundamental part of what I think we do as local history departments. And I think even if you are not working specifically in a local history department or your library doesn't necessarily have one, I think it's something that kind of touches on every library that has its roots in a community. This is going to be relevant, and it's something that I think, I don't think I've ever come across a library that doesn't work with these things to some degree. And maybe the most fundamental thing to remember is local history departments and libraries in general have the potential to be sort of really living, engaged collections which represent people and are sort of created with the people that they represent. And part of why we need to do that is because we have to sort of remind people that the place they live is theirs to imagine, and it's theirs to imagine differently if they want as well. So this is, it's not just history, it's how we go forward into the future as well, by building these traditional stories, memories, and people's history into how we imagine places. So I will try to shut up here, and if you've got questions, it would be really good to try and answer them. And also, I want to hear everybody's favourite local legends from where you've come from as well. So please either share your legends now or come and find me later.
So thank you, Erin. That was really great. I think there's some really beautiful examples of capturing those cultural experiences and what that means to people, especially during lockdown when people felt so isolated. Just to invite the floor now, has anyone got a question just now for Erin, or a local legend from your own area that you want to share? I can see people conferring. They do have stories out there. I'll let you put your hand up rather than pick on you. I can see someone shaking their head there. Don't pick me. So while folks are getting ready to ask a question, I do have a question, Erin, just about the work that you've done and how that gets captured and maintained and looked after in the longer term. And just some of the discussions in Dundee, have there been any about the maintenance of this and collecting policies? What's that meant in the conversations you've had as a service area?
That's a really good question, and I decided not to go into that during the talk because it would just be me going, ah! Yeah, interestingly enough, we haven't had a formal collecting policy for the local history department. I've got a draft one sitting in my folder, waiting to kind of go out for people to read through it and comment on, because I think it's really important that we do actually have policies around these things, just because it helps you, it helps you decide what you're going to do. And for the kind of preserving things as well, I don't know how much I should be saying about this. When I started, we kind of had a digital preservation policy that was basically like, digitize everything and then don't let people see the real stuff. So we'll be changing that. I think digitizing things is great, especially in the case of something like cassette tapes, where the medium is really at risk. It's not going to last forever in that format. But it's not a case of never let people see the real things once you've digitized kind of pictures or newspapers or something like that. It is actually quite hard walking the line between access and preservation sometimes, and we do kind of tend to err on the side of access in our department, because everything we have basically has come from the people of Dundee, and I don't really feel like it's up to us to make judgments about who's a real researcher and who's allowed to see a real thing and who only gets to see a surrogate. But yeah, I'm starting to think about ways we can use our budget, which has traditionally only gone on books. I think we should be sort of ring fencing a portion of that. I don't know if anyone from my institution is here going, you haven't run this past us yet, but we need to be ring fencing some of our resource budget for conserving the stuff that already exists. And I don't think there's going to be any, objection to that. It's just that maybe it hasn't been thought of in the past as a thing we need to be doing. Does that help?
Yeah,
so we're kind of starting from scratch in a lot of ways on these points, but I'm really glad you asked about them, because it's really important to have these, plans in place when you start collecting things.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers it. It does sometimes feel like an area that doesn't get the same level of attention as other parts that are a bit more tangible to the public and to people who pay the budget to us. Any questions from the floor now? Yeah, I've got one over here.
Hi there. I was also going to ask about collections policy, but I was also just wanted to say how brilliant that was, and I was nodding furiously along with everything you were saying about the importance of local history and oral history, but also about the issues with resources and time. And I really like the idea of what are we doing in Scotland together to support a network and to share skills and things like that. So I'd love to hear and see more of that. But going back to collecting, I just wondered, have you been doing any local collecting since lockdown, since talk about the importance of the super local? Has there been opportunity to collect oral histories?
Yeah, so I've not done anything yet. I have been talking to the Scottish Council on Archives. They have a project starting up soon where we will be collecting oral histories of people who have recently come to Scotland and their experiences of living here. So that's probably going to be the next time I actually get to get out with a recorder and do interviews, which I'm really looking forward to. During lockdown itself, we did, just to kind of get a snapshot of what people were thinking, we did a very, very simple kind of Google form type thing, where it's asking people in Dundee about what their experience of lockdown's like, has their work changed, you know, what's their daily routine like under lockdown. So that was very much in the first lockdown. So that's kind of a text-based thing rather than oral. And there was a project that we did with a local art group called Scrap Antics, which there was an element where people were making kind of textile art inspired by the River Tay, but also we did some it was digital, it was over Zoom, the interviews we were doing, which isn't necessarily ideal from a kind of recording quality point of view, but it was sort of working with what we had at the time, because this was right in the peak of the second lockdown, it ended up happening. But it was speaking to people about how their relationship with the Tay and that sort of landscape, how that was changing through lockdown, and most people did say it was a kind of a solace. I think, you know, it was quite a self-selecting sample in a way, because you're going, who knows the River Tay and wants to have a conversation about it? But I do think there's some really interesting perspectives on how place fits into people's lives, and that kind of renewed local focus during lockdown from that as well. So we do have digital files for these, but again, figuring out how to make these digital files accessible to the public. I think when you're working with a big kind of local authority website, there's so many people to go through before you can just like upload stuff. I don't know if anyone else kind of has that struggle. But again, we're working on it, and I would love to hear from anyone else who has successfully made oral histories digitally available through a sort of library website.
Are there any more questions, or does anyone have an experience of getting their content sort of accessible and published out there beyond a council website, which can be challenging? I did have another question for you, Erin, and it was just about your own experiences as a storyteller. It does require usually a lot of performance skill when you're engaging audiences. What kind of hints and tips would you give people for encouraging, through their own storytelling, to cultivate those stories from other people?
Oh, that's good. So like for people who are thinking about telling stories or for collecting them, or kind of both?
For both, when you're looking for that first point of contact for getting people to share their first stories with you.
I think it is good to often come in with a story to tell yourself and kind of start the ball rolling. I also think there's a lot of potential for if you have like images or something to work from that's going to spark a lot of memories, that can be a really good way of getting conversation going, especially if you're working with a group. So that's somewhere that the local history collections can come in handy as well. Sort of photographs or sort of newspaper adverts and things in newspapers as well, like local newspapers, really spark a lot of memories for people if it's something they grew up with in the house. So sometimes bringing things that give people sort of a safe shared point of starting off. You know, we all read the People's Journal or the Sunday Post growing up, and then it goes off into different people's experiences. And I think so much of being a storyteller is listening as well. So like practicing kind of listening to people is really it's really important when it comes to telling your own stories and sort of thinking about what works when you're hearing it rather than what works when you're reading it. If you are thinking about learning traditional stories to tell yourself, which you totally should, I find it really helps to start thinking of like key images throughout the story rather than trying to remember like all the words of what happens. You have these points that, you know, you can imagine sort of the dragon curled round the well at Strathmartin, and then, you know, you imagine Martin swinging his hammer round his head to come and whack it, and then you need to get from point A to point B, but you're not remembering the words of everything that happens in between. It's quite image-based, the way that I think about stories a lot of the time. So does that make sense? And I suppose that's why these images are so important for inspiring people to talk about their own stories as well, maybe.
Thank you. Last call for a question or a local legend. Got one at the back.
Hello.
Hi.
What platforms are you using to get your, like when you were doing those weekly videos in lockdown, what are you just putting them on your website? Are you using YouTube, like social media?
Yeah.
And are you getting a better response from certain platforms than others, like more engagement? Like what works?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we put them out on the Dundee Libraries has a YouTube channel. So we put them out on that and then shared them via Facebook and Twitter. And Facebook, I think, just because that's where the libraries have the biggest following, is where they got the most views and comments. And that might vary, like if your institution actually has a really strong Twitter presence, but not so much of a Facebook one, it'll probably be Twitter that gets the most views. We didn't really try Instagram for these. I do have an Instagram, but I'm not very good at it. So, but yeah, it was pretty much the Twitter and Facebook, which, like, there were some comments left on the actual YouTubes themselves as well, which I kept forgetting to check, because I just sort of go to the social media posts and then realised, oh, somebody said something really nice on the YouTube. Realised that a few weeks later. But I don't know if I'm not sure I'm quite a social media expert. I'm lucky that I did have somebody helping me with the tech side of things as well. There was somebody working from our creative services team who looked after the YouTube for me. But yeah, it's I think yeah, I think it probably depends on where your audience mostly is online to begin with, where you'll get the most traffic. And I suppose there is things to think about as well, like with Twitter you can't embed the whole video, you just have to put a link to the YouTube, whereas on Facebook you could upload the whole video because they let you have that longer viewing time. So that's something as well that affected what went up where.
Thank you. That's bringing the session to a close. I do think there are some stories people have out there, and I think over lunchtime, if you want to share them with Erin, I think she'd be happy to hear them. And that just brings us to the end of this session. If you can join me in thanking Erin again. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's been really nice to have such a full room here.